Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. I'm really glad that all of you could tune in today to our meeting From Sea to Sea, how satellites can help identify and combat ocean plastic pollution. At the China Environment Forum, where I've worked for 23 years, 21, I can't even know, it's over 20 years, we'll get that. For the past 4 years, I've been doing a lot of investigations into sludge and food waste challenges in China. And 2 years ago, we expanded our research and webinars and publications into ocean plastic issues. And we have 2 projects right now. And one is with our Science, Technology, and Innovation Program's Serious Games Initiative to create an educational video game about plastic waste. And today's meeting is part of our other plastic project called Turning the Tide on Plastic Waste in Asia, that's looking into innovations and partnerships around the world, but particularly in Asia, on how to stem the tide of ocean plastics. Now, I actually have to admit that our first speaker today, Grayson Shore, he was the one who I went to initially and said, this would be a really cool meeting for us to talk about what you were doing over in the State Department because, well, with the Minderoo Foundation, because this is a beautiful example of technology and innovation to try to deal with the ocean plastic problem. So today we're going to start out with, I like keeping intros short because it's, webinar and you all have things to do. I'm going to first ask Grayson Shore, who serves as a Foreign Affairs Officer at the US Department of State in the Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs Marine Debris Team. He's going to help set the stage and briefly introduce the group here, the Minderoo Foundation supported Global Plastic Watch Platform. And after he speaks, I have Fabien Laure, who is currently the Director of Technology. He's the Director of Technology and Innovation for Minderoo's No Plastic Waste Initiative. He's going to give more details on ocean plastic challenges in the world, and more specifically, what the Global Plastic Watch Platform, what is it? And Caleb Cruz, I guess kind of maybe ping-ponging with Fabien. He's a researcher with Earthrise Media focused on using artificial intelligence to better the environment. And he's going to give a high-level overview of the methods and technology of the platform and show a snippet of how it works. I'm focusing on Indonesia, which happens to be one of the countries we've been focusing a lot on this year. And following maybe a little bit more the deeper tech, we're going to turn to Dr. Lauren Bierman, who is a marine remote sensing scientist with a background in molecular biology, oceanography, and biogeochemistry, which I never knew was a field, and I'm excited to know that now, and optics. She works at UK's Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and she's going to be really showing you about what the kind of work she does about detecting and identifying floating macroplastics in rivers and ocean environments. And closing up the presentation part today is Ellen Ramirez, who's a supervisory scientist in the NOAA Satellite Analysis branch. So she's here in Washington, D.C., not too far from me. And she oversees the 24/7 supported satellite-based detection and reporting of environmental hazards, which of course includes marine pollution. And she's going to be talking about NOAA's research in marine debris, which is relatively new, and kind of the role that NOAA is playing in this initiative. So I'm going to, Grayson, if you could bring up your slides, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to you. And I want to remind people that if you look on the webpage underneath, that there's the China Environment Forum Twitter and email, that you could start submitting questions. And I'm going to mute and let things go from here. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. Great introduction there. I apologize, I have a split screen here. So I have my monitor over here and my computer over here. My notes are over here. So I'm looking over here, but I know you're all over on this side. So let me hop into it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer and the Wilson Center for this opportunity to join today's panel on how satellites can help identify, combat plastic marine debris. To just briefly introduce myself, my name is Grayson Shore, and I serve in the United States Department of State's Bureau of Oceans, International Environmental, and Scientific Affairs. At the State Department, my work focuses on addressing marine debris internationally on behalf of the American people, together with committed subject matter experts across the US government and key partners such as my fellow esteemed panelists here. The goal of our webinar today is to briefly introduce a 21st century way of filling a critical data gap in understanding of ocean plastic pollution, and as a means to enable data-driven, smarter policymaking. And this critical gap comes from the fact that it is very difficult to measure the presence of plastic, including its concentration and type in the environment. Specifically, we'll cover how we can help fill that gap by identifying plastic pollution on land and in rivers and the open ocean. Next slide here. All right. So plastic is one of the most ubiquitous materials in the global economy, which is due to the benefits that plastic has endowed on society. Plastic is lightweight, durable, making it suitable for a variety of uses that are protective of human health, such as medical supplies, food packaging, and even car parts and technology products. Yet due to the beneficial uses, plastic production has exponentially increased, as you can see on my slide here, since first becoming a consumer product in the 1950s. In fact, in 70 years, roughly 50% of all plastics have been made in just about the past 2 decades. Environmentally sound management of plastic waste and scrap has not kept pace with global demand for plastic. Many countries lack environmentally sound management infrastructure, collection, sorting, recycling, and final disposal to prevent leakage of plastic waste and scrap into the environment, including the oceans. In addition, countries have enacted barriers to trade in plastic scrap that hinder global recycling markets as well. When plastic scrap and waste leak into the environment, it breaks apart and can accumulate, leading to impacts to ecosystems and economies. Notable impacts have been observed on fisheries and the marine tourism sector, for one. To be clear, the United States is committed to working with partners to address ocean plastic pollution and recognizes that the benefits of innovative tools such as satellite imaging and monitoring can help countries address plastic and ocean plastic pollution. As exemplified in this graph, recent estimates predict that under a business as usual scenario, by 2040, plastic pollution entering the ocean annually could triple from about 11 million metric tons in 2016 to 29 million metric tons by 2040. And what does that mean, right? It's just a big number. Well, let me put that in context for you. So for reference, 10 million metric tons is equivalent in weight to over 100 large aircraft carriers. So it's a massive amount of plastic entering the ocean each year under this business as usual scenario. The impact on our marine environment and the livelihoods of those who depend on the ocean is immense. In 2015 alone, it was calculated that marine debris cost Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation member economies, also known as APEC member economies, over $11 billion through losses on fisheries, tourism, marine transport, and more. And again, that's just in 1 year, in 2015. That number potentially could be much higher today. Also, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated this crisis in ways that we don't fully yet comprehend, as the disposal of single-use plastics such as gloves and have skyrocketed. So because of the rapidly growing impact of ocean plastic pollution on the environment, this issue has gained global attention. For example, many of you here today are watching this panel event. So in the last 5 years, the number of international plastic waste initiatives has more than doubled. And as you can see that here on my slide. Compared to a decade ago, the number of peer-reviewed papers on plastic marine debris or pollution has grown 6-fold. And media attention has also significantly increased, resulting in enhanced pressure from the general public for companies and governments to reduce ocean plastic pollution. Governments have taken note too. As of last year, 156 countries have reported they collectively have taken 296 actions to address ocean plastic pollution. So the United States and the international community have ramped up our efforts to address this issue, especially in recent years. This is in response to growing public interest and pressure to address ocean plastic pollution. In the United States, this issue has received bipartisan support, as seen by the recent passage of the Save Our Seas Act 2.0, or SOS 2.0 for short. Congress unanimously passed, and I want to emphasize unanimously passed in December, the substantial legislation which states its goal is to, quote, improve efforts to combat marine debris. Senator Sullivan called SOS 2.0, and I quote here again, the most comprehensive marine debris legislation ever to pass the US Senate, end quote. Currently, governments across the globe, including the US, are spending millions of dollars a year on this issue. For example, in November of last year, the US International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC for short, announced a new $2.5 billion ocean plastics initiative aimed at curbing the flow of plastic into the marine environment. So with all this together, it's indeed evident that the value of understanding this issue and finding ways to measure our efforts is increasingly apparent. As countries work together to address ocean plastic pollution, they are typically interested in answering these key questions. And I won't read them, but they're on my slide here, these 4 questions. Despite progress in understanding the multiple dimensions of ocean plastic pollution over the decades, most of our knowledge remains quite limited and based on theoretical estimates rather than observed data. In order to address ocean plastic pollution and its impacts, there is a need for better data on the main sources of plastic pollution, its distribution and its abundance on land and sea, as well as data on the transport and the fate of plastic once it enters the environment. We want to ensure that we are making effective investments in addressing ocean plastic pollution, and we believe scalable and regular ways to monitor and evaluate our efforts are indeed important. So kind of in sum here, to kind of give it in bullet point format, our problem here is that a major obstacle to effectively address this issue is that most information available about ocean plastic pollution is based on theoretical estimates rather than observed data. Our proposed solution is to develop a scalable and inclusive system for accurately identifying ocean plastic pollution. And how? Well, we aim to do this by promoting the use of satellite imagery and emerging geospatial analytical tools. And I want to point out too that this is just one tool in a evolving toolkit as well. So I'm not saying that this is one way to, the only way to address this issue, but this is certainly a good path forward. And lastly, the benefit. By generating accurate data on ocean plastic pollution, pathways and concentration not only advances scientific knowledge about this issue, it also beneficially helps inform and measure the effectiveness of policy interventions, regulations, and related responses. So with that, thank you for your attention. And Fabian, over to you. I will stop sharing my screen here. Give me a minute here.
And while he's doing that, let me remind people watching that you can start now to tweet questions at Wilson Center CEF or email. The email's listed below, but it's elijahpatton@wilsoncenter.org. Send in those questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Grayson, for setting the stage so beautifully. Thank you for the Wilson Center and to you, Jennifer, for bringing us together. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Fabian Ollier, very excited to be here. I am the Director for Technology and Innovation at the Minderoo Foundation. And so I thought that I would start by presenting a bit of background on the foundation. So it was established 20 years ago by Dr. Andrew Forrest and his wife, Nicola. The offices are in Perth, Australia, but they have offices all around the world. Minderoo is one of Asia's largest philanthropic organizations with over $2 billion in endowment that are committed in support of a wide range of impact initiatives globally. One of those initiatives is the No Plastic Waste Initiative, which has the dual goal of stopping plastic leakage in the environment, as well as maximizing circularity in the plastic economy, and all of that by 2030. There are 5 different main focus areas, and today I will be discussing how technology and innovation can help accelerate and provide much greater transparency across the entire plastic value chain for a variety of reasons that Grayson actually mentioned. So I am going to show you some of the work that the technical team has done so far. I wouldn't say that we have a platform yet, but what we're doing is that we are sort of designing the plane while we are building it, while we are trying to fly it. And really right now, the main focus is really the engine. So how can we generate enough of an engine that we can then construct this platform around? So we all know, plastic pollution is ubiquitous. It's a massive environmental issue. We know that the main sources of plastic in the ocean are actual rivers. And of course, we know that once the plastic is in the ocean, the battle is essentially lost because plastic end up in places where it is almost nearly impossible to clean up. The plastic is then left to go and severely impact marine wildlife. We're talking about like 100,000 marine mammals being killed every single year and over 1 million seabirds getting poisoned by plastic being in the ocean. So Grayson, did a great job showing like how, if you look at not only the historical trends, but also the projected ones, that the scale of the problem is massive and it's not getting any better. The issue is, well, we don't have the right tools in place. We don't have the right decision support tools, given that what currently the community is relying on are estimates as opposed to observed data. And we all know that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. We actually need data. If we are going to stop plastic from getting into the ocean, we need to know where it is on land to begin with. And so without such a clearer picture, it's going to be very difficult to address the problem. Of course, we want to also stop the plastic production, or at least increase the circularity of it, in addition to dealing with the pollution itself. So we've assembled with Minderu's Foundation support a group of experts, including experts in waste management, experts in remote sensing, expert in machine learning, design, and product development, to essentially develop a methodology that we believe is reliable and scalable, and that can get us to an actual data-driven solution to help address the issue. We have focused our initial pilot on Indonesia, and the work of the technical team built on the wonderful pioneering research that Dr. Bierman initiated. And it entails harnessing the power of global real-time satellite imagery, pair satellite imagery, or apply machine learning on the satellite imagery in order to derive an ability to detect as well as monitor plastic waste in the environment, particularly in that case on land, with the goal of stopping it. We use satellite imagery because we know that it is a low-cost, credible, consistent, and globally comparable source of information. And so sort of the theory is that if we can detect plastic in a particular place here in Indonesia and stop it before it gets into the ocean, that's an approach that we believe is completely scalable. So as I mentioned, this is sort of, dealing with the pollution is only sort of, one side of the problem. And really, I mean, the sort of the holy grail is to be able to stop the use of virgin polymer to produce single-use plastic. And that's the reason why Minderu has also invested significant resources and time to assemble, to date, the largest, most comprehensive data set about the material and financial flows of single-use plastic across the entire supply chain. The results of that study will be released in a month or so. But what I can tell you is that for pretty much any single pieces of single-use plastic that's out there in the market, we can tell you which bank financed it. We can tell you which company produced it. We can tell you where it was produced. We can tell you where it was traded and where it turned into pollution, essentially. And we can also tell you who are the owners of all of the different assets along the supply chain. The goal here is to use all those data, bring them together in a data-driven decision support tool to essentially allow us to track from production all the way to pollution. And the type of impact, of course, that we want to be able to sort of measure our success against is, for example, being able to inform enforcement, because we will be able to tell you in near real time where there are some of those illegal, informal plastic waste dumping all over the world. As Grayson mentioned, we want to make sure that any sort of regulatory policy intervention are guided by real observed data, not outdated estimates. And moving forward, what we really want to be able to do is to measure effectiveness of those interventions. And so, the system will be responding if you're able to, stop, let's say, the use of single-use plastic, then you should start seeing a decrease in the environment. And we can tell you all of that from space in near real time. Environmental justice, those communities around the world that are impacted by plastic don't really have the tools to be able to conduct evidence-based advocacy, and we want to be able to change that. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the accountability is something that we really want to be able to drive. So tracking plastic pollution globally, in addition to tracing it back to those who produce it and those who finance it. Last but not least, from a scientific and so state of the knowledge standpoint, we talked a lot about those estimates. Sometimes they are outdated or sort of inconsistent. So we want to bring data to help validate and ultimately improve some of those estimates and some of those scientific models. So I want to thank our partners, of course, Mineral Foundation, but also Earthrise Media, who has been leading a lot of the technical work and has produced this data story. I want to thank Dr. Bierman from the Plymouth Marine Lab. I want to thank Dr. Jembek from University of Georgia. And of course, I want to give special shout out to Systemic, the European Space Agency, and of course, NOAA. And with that, I will turn it to Caleb, who is going to talk about the methodology and the much more cool and fancy technical stuff that I'm not qualified to talk about.
Okay, Caleb, get fancy on us here.
Oh boy, high stakes here. But all right, I'm Caleb, and I'll be give me one sec. Sharing a high-level overview of the work that we're doing on detecting land-based sources of plastics using satellite imagery. And like Fabian had described, this is a really important part of the problem, because if we're able to understand the terrestrial component, then we might be able to kind of stop the plastics at the source before they actually get into the ocean and cause these downstream consequences. So this work is going to be, or this presentation is going to be a very high-level overview of some of the methods that we've been working on to do the plastics detection, and it's going to be focused on three parts. First is detection, then it's monitoring, and finally scaling this solution up to be able to monitor a large area. So first on detection. These are the types of sites that we started with. We're starting in Indonesia, and in particular working on Bali. And on Bali, we know that there are 10 of these known official landfill sites, which are really plastics dominated. On the left here, you can see what they look like from the ground, and on the right, you can see what they look like in high resolution satellite imagery. Now, in the imagery from above, they have some spatial characteristics, but ultimately they don't look that different than a bare earth patch. So detecting them from space is certainly a challenge. What we can do is we can sort of try to build up a profile of what these sites look like and see if they can be differentiated from other classes. So these yellow points here on this map of Bali are these 10 known landfill locations. You can compare them against a selection of hand-picked sites that might be similar or help us build up a profile for what these dump sites might look like. To do this analysis, we're working with data from the Sentinel-2 platform. And Sentinel-2, I think Lauren will talk about in more detail, but it's a powerful platform. And the key takeaway here is, for this work, is that it has 12 bands or channels for sensing information. So it has your standard red, green, and blue channels that produce the visible spectrum images that we're used to seeing. But it goes all the way much further out into the infrared to be able to kind of capture some characteristics of sites that we can't actually see with our human eye, but might be important for detecting a different type of material. For this pipeline, what we do is we have this stack of imagery, 12 channels, and from this imagery, we break it apart into its individual pixels and look at the spectral profile at each of the pixels. So that spectral profile hopefully will carry some information about whether that pixel contains plastics or does not. Now, when we look at them in aggregate, this is roughly what we see. So what we're looking at on this chart is on the x-axis, we have the wavelength of light that Sentinel is looking at. And on the y-axis, we have the reflectance. What we see here in red are the profiles of these dump sites, and in blue are the profiles of non-dump sites. And roughly, we can see that dump sites do have a bit of a different profile than the non-dump sites, but there also still is a good bit of overlap. So it's promising, but there's still a question of whether they'll be differentiable. You know, it's not a simple heuristic that you can craft. So what we did is there's a lot of bands and information for each of these pixels. And from the previous chart, you can see it might be hard to craft sort of a handcrafted rule to say what is plastics and what is not. And so we turned the problem over to a neural network. Now, a neural network is really good at taking advantage of this high dimensional information to kind of interpret that, synthesize it, and then ultimately make a classification for each pixel. And so you pass it that spectral profile for each pixel in a region, and then the network will give a prediction of saying, I think that's a 70% chance that this is plastics, or I think that this is not plastics at all, it's a forest. I won't go into details on the network, but I will say it's extremely small as far as neural networks go. So most of the models you hear about in the news these days are billions of parameters. This is 30,000. And the reason for keeping it so small is the training data is very limited. If you remember, we're only working off of 10 known dump sites. And so we have to be creative with how we're shaping our network and crafting our input data. And here's what the results look like. So on the left here, we see this is a landfill site in Indonesia. You can kind of see this is the core landfill, as well as a river nearby and a bare earth patch. These are what the neural network probability predictions look like. So blue, it says not at all a landfill. Dark red, it says very likely to be this landfill or waste aggregation. And you can see that the network does a good job of picking out where the landfill site is and rejecting sites that, you know, might just be bare earth or not related. Finally, this is a thresholded prediction. So go from these confidences that the neural network produces to just saying yes or no, this pixel is a landfill. So that's really compelling. The network is able to, for each pixel in this image, to be able to classify whether it's a landfill or not. As I said before, we're working on Bali to begin with and in Indonesia, but the model does show signs of also generalizing. So here's an example of a landfill that is in India, and you can see these little active lobes where they're dumping waste, and the network does a good job of picking up the detected regions. Of course, this isn't as clean as the previous image, but does show real potential for the network to be able to identify and detect these waste aggregations. So some compelling work there. Once we have this system to detect where plastic waste aggregations are, we can then monitor the situation to be able to understand how that waste aggregation is developing. You know, has it disappeared? Has it changed in size? And that's what we've done for this example site in Bali that we call Temesi. Now, it's a little hard to see here, but in the images here are the actual data from Sentinel across time. And kind of the key to take a look at is you can see this lighter region in the image is the landfill. And by eye, we can roughly say it seems to have expanded in size. Now, if we run the neural network on every input data that we have, roughly refreshes every 2 weeks or so, depends if it's cloudy in the area as well. We can see that the neural network is picking up on a change in the site over time. Here, the red is the network's predictions for where the landfill is. And we can synthesize these into really important and interesting insights. So on the left, you can see a graph of how this landfill, Temesi, has changed over time. And on the right, you can actually see the geometry as it's changing through time. On the right, we're viewing it from 2019 through the end of 2020. And you can really get a sense for how that site has just rapidly expanded. Now, we can also know, not only how it's expanding, but also its location. This right here is a river, and Temesi is very close to the ocean. So if we have a platform of detected sites that we're then monitoring, you'd be able to sort of raise a red flag and say, hey, Temesi has increased by 500% in the last year or two, and it's right by a river, and it's close to an ocean output. You could then make sure that this is a site that's being either properly maintained or maybe actively, work to diminish the impact of that landfill. So then the last part about this, I know this is all fast, but it's just good to give an overview of what the technique is working on and where it's going. The last part is scaling this up. So we've been focusing on single sites and how we can detect single sites and monitor, but can we do this for a large region? And the answer is we can. It's pretty promising. So far we've run this system on Bali, and we've run it on Java. And this kind of synthesizes the pipeline as a whole and shows what it's capable of. So if you remember from before, we're taking every single 10 by 10 meter pixel on the island of Java, and the network's going to output a class probability. So areas in really bright white are areas that the network is pretty certain have some waste, and the areas that are dark, it says nothing to see here. On this image, so we run the whole neural network on all of Java, and then from this image, we detect the kind of brightest blobs of pixels to identify candidate sites. And you see that the network has identified these collection of candidate sites across the island. Now, I think that there are probably this many small scale aggregations of plastics on the island. But right now the network is best at identifying sort of larger scale aggregations of plastics. And so what we see when we look at the actual predictions of the network is it's found a lot of plastics that aren't waste. If by looking at it on a per pixel basis, you are detecting plastics, but it might not be the type that we're specifically interested in. So for example, I noticed it was detecting a ton of these buildings, which when we look at that with Street View, they're these plastic greenhouses. So I think that's a great statement about the spectral classifier, that it is picking up on these plastics, but we need one more level to be able to say, okay, this is plastic, but it's not the type that we're interested in. And for that, we need spatial information. So for every candidate site, those little points you saw in Java before, for every candidate site, we extract not just a spectral profile of a single pixel, but we extract one of those patches of multispectral spatial imagery. And from above, it's very clear that this is a greenhouse, it's not a landfill site. So we pass this to a second neural network that then produces a classification based on the spatial information that's available in the patch. And it gives us, for every candidate site, a final decision on yes or no, this is a waste site or is not. Here's an example of waste sites that are detected on Java. So you can see they kind of have a very different characteristic, and also you can kind of verify them from high resolution satellite imagery where that is available. So this is a larger landfill site, and this is much more a smaller informal dumping ground. When we look at this across Java, you can see how this system is pretty powerful, and the data that we have scales up pretty quickly. Here are the close to 90 detected and verified landfill sites on the island, and ideally we can be monitoring all of these through time as well. So that's a high-level overview of the work that we're doing. Excited to be able to expand it more, improve the specificity and sensitivity of the model, as well as run it on the whole world, scale it up to be able to have a platform that can just every 2 weeks monitor the entire globe to be able to detect the location of plastics and how they're changing over time. Cool. I think we're going to go to Lauren now.
Caleb, that was great. I actually read a kind of an AI for Dummies book a little while back, And your presentation was like, oh, it's clicking. Thank you so much for that. So let's move it on over to Lauren.
It's very powerful.
See how I will get even smarter from your presentation. And you feel free to sharing your slides.
Yes, thanks. That was an excellent introduction. So I'm going to move what Fabian and Grayson and Caleb have been talking about into quite a specific marine context, because that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. I've been attempting to use high-resolution satellite imagery to help us detect patches of floating plastics in coastal ocean waters. I like there is this idea, as Fabian was talking about, really about these big global models, these huge circulation models that sit and sort of inform us where plastics are supposedly ending up in the ocean. And a lot of them are fantastic, but they're really large scale. And on the other end, we have really fine scale in situ data, literally people with nets scooping up to see what plastics are in the water, or standing on bridges and watching it flow past to get an idea of composition or flux. And the gap between there can be so well filled with satellites because it is observed data. What we're seeing from satellite isn't modeled, it's observation data. But this hasn't been done really until recently, because it was only recently that we were able to demonstrate for the first time that high resolution optical data collected by satellites can be used for this purpose, for detecting marine macroplastics. So the paper that we worked on was published in April of last year, just to give you an idea of how new this already is. And it's also entirely thanks to the Copernicus program that this actually happened at all, because Caleb has mentioned Sentinel-2, but thanks to the Copernicus program, anyone can have access to that data entirely for free. So I have access to it for free, and you can have access to it for free. And I can talk about the different types of satellites under the Copernicus program for hours, but you'll just have to trust me that out of all of the options that we have, Sentinel-2 is the right tool for the job. Certainly in the marine environment, it sits in this Goldilocks zone. We get data every 2 to 5 days. We get it at 10-meter spatial resolution, which is great for marine applications. And we also have access to the 12 bands that Caleb explained as well. And I'm going to take it a step further. I think he did a really good job of explaining it, but I'm going to anthropomorphize Sentinel-2 a little bit and explain the multispectral instrument that collects this data as its eyes. And so it can see in the visible range in the way that we can, and that it collects data in the red, the green, and the blue, but it can also see into that part of the electromagnetic spectrum where we can't see. So the near infrared and the shortwave infrared, as Caleb said. But what does that actually mean? So I've got a nice example here. I thought we've all been stuck at home, and the place I really want to go is Thailand. So here we are, we're all in Thailand together. And this is a typical Sentinel-2 scene over Thailand. Here's Da Nang, and there's some beautiful marine protected areas down here, I believe, and I'd love to go scuba diving there one day. But as you can see, this image is a bit hazy. And so you and I, we're going to go and do an atmospheric correction together. So here we go. We're going to apply an atmospheric correction, and we're going to remove the contributions from the atmosphere, the Rayleigh scattering. And everything's a bit clearer. You can now see this beautiful submesoscale feature in the water, that's an eddy, and you can see some fronts with lots of dynamic things happening in the water, and you can see a lot more detail on land and around the coastline as well. So this is an RGB image. What I've asked Sentinel-2 to do is to recreate what I would see if I were looking down on Da Nang myself. So it's used that information in the visible range. But now I'm going to ask Sentinel-2 to tell me what it saw in the near infrared. And what I would like you to do is to sort of focus on any of these areas over here as I ask Sentinel-2 to move from the visible into the near infrared wavelengths of light. And now what you might have been able to see there, and I hope the resolution is good enough, is that things that were completely indistinct, if not invisible in the RGB, have become much brighter and more evident. So we're going to go back to the RGB, the true color image. I'm going to apply the near infrared again. And there you go. You see lots of little things floating on the surface of the water, and they're very clear. And this is possible because of the fact that water is extremely efficient at absorbing light in the near infrared wavelengths. Anything floating on the surface of the water is going to reflect. And that principle is true for boats, and it is also true for macroplastics. So when I talk about observing macroplastics in marine environments, I'm talking about the kinds of plastics that you can see, that you can hold in your hand. The takeaway container that you got your dinner in last night, a plastic water bottle. And I'm also looking specifically at coastal waters. This is where Sentinel-2 collects its data, but also, as Fabian has so aptly demonstrated, and Caleb as well, that's where the plastic leaks from. The main amount of plastic entering the oceans comes from land. And until Fabian fixes this problem and solves it entirely, once those plastics enter the coastal zone, if they don't recirculate onto beaches, if they don't sink, and if they're not removed through active cleanup operations, then these plastics will enter the open ocean. And I echo what he says here, and what Grayson said as well. We know the sorts of nefarious things that plastics get up to when they're in the open ocean. You don't need to see pictures of it. I think if you're anything like me, you already have enough in your head, but they can become ingested, they can entangle marine life. And also bigger chunks of plastics through the process of mechanical wave action or UV degradation can also degrade into microplastics. And then we have no chance of removing them. So we'd like to stop it before it enters the land, and certainly if it does enter the coastal zone, before it enters the open ocean. So there's a real incentive, certainly for my work, to continue to look for plastics in the coastal zone. And this is kind of a day in the life of a satellite scientist looking for plastics. It's an ongoing process. Every day I review the literature for new papers or social media that have hashtag plastic pollution. And then if I see something interesting or promising, I'll go and look for that data from the Sentinel-2 satellite. And I look for cloud-free images that has a sub-mesoscale feature like a front. And if it's all there, I'll download that data. And then I do the processing. Each scene can take me up to half a day. I do an atmospheric correction, just like we did. I then use different indices to highlight things floating on the surface of the water. I also have a lineup of all of the things that float on water, whether natural or plastic, so I can start to tell apart what seems to be, for example, driftwood or seaweed or sea foam, and tell that apart from what looks like it is plastic. And so I use the spectral signature of plastic to help me inform manually. It's a bit of a needle in a haystack exercise, which pixel individually looks like plastic. And then I extract those and I feed that into a machine learning classifier. We've gone for a naive Bayes. We have even less data than Caleb does, so we couldn't go for a neural network, but the naive Bayes works extremely well and it works very quickly. Of course, it did take months and months for us to make a suitable training data set. So as you can see, it's a really time-consuming process, but the good thing about it is that it's really robust and reproducible, meaning that with this, we can go find macroplastics in the wild. And this is all published in the paper that I was talking about. These are the areas where we found macroplastics in the wild. And when I published this, what I liked about it was that it shows that plastics are not a developing world problem. It's not a Southeast Asia problem. I found plastics just as easily in Canada as I did off Vietnam. And so it's not just that there are rivers like the Elbe River in Germany emitting up to 800 tons of plastic into the North Sea every year. It's that actually if we don't work together, we're not going to be able to solve the plastics pollution problem. So in a way, this is a democratizer, and this is an issue that we all need to look at together. And the other thing when I published this paper is quite funny. I thought I'd published like a relatively technically interesting paper. And I was utterly unprepared for the type of response that I got. So I had journalists phoning me up. I really didn't expect that. And they'd say things like, oh my God, you've solved the marine plastics problem. And I was like, I absolutely have not. If I've done anything as I've shown that the problem is bad enough that we can now see it from space. But the other thing that I didn't expect, certainly when I was being interviewed, I'd say things like, I really hope that this work can serve as a platform for other people to take it forward and do great things with it. And never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be sitting here less than a year later with people like Grayson and Ellen and Caleb and Fabian, who haven't just used it as a base, they've used it as a springboard. And we're able to look at plastics all over the world now with greater efficiency and with greater meaning, really, because I think what Minderu is going to do is going to be an absolute game changer. So it's wonderful to be involved in this village, because it really is going to take a village to try and tackle the plastic pollution problem in the marine environment. So I just want to say thank you to my village. And it's over to Ellen. So
thank you so much. And I'm honored you put us in your village too.
Yeah.
No, fabulous work. And yeah, I mean, right time, right place. But yeah, it's great to hear what you're doing. And Ellen, you guys are all making, you guys, I have to know that you guys are making what's could be really scary and intimidating and confusing pretty darn clear. So thank you on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much to the previous presenters. I'm honored to be in the village as well. Good morning to the Wilson Center audience. Thank you for having me. My name is Ellen Ramirez. I am a supervisory scientist with the NOAA Satellite Analysis branch. So compared to the previous presentations and research that has been presented, we're more of an operational unit, which is a really important component of how we take some of the work that you've seen and put it into an operational context such that the information is usable and it's actionable. So I'm going to give you a quick background of my affiliation. It is with NOAA in the US federal government. And the satellite analysis branch has been around for about 5 decades. We produce satellite-based value-added products needed to support disaster management authorities and civil protection agencies. And that includes marine pollution, both oil spills and marine debris. We're located in the Washington, D.C. metro area in College Park. So a little bit of the backstory of how we got started in our marine debris detection efforts. First, I want to say that NOAA does have a marine debris program. In 2006, Congress authorized the NOAA Marine Debris Program as the US federal government's lead for addressing marine debris. And the marine debris achieves its mission through 5 main pillars: removal, prevention, research, regional coordination, and emergency response. So that resides in the ocean service portion of NOAA, and I'm on the satellite side. So we're trying to demonstrate the proof of concept techniques to use satellite imagery to support their 5 main pillars. So we do have that program. So the backstory of how we became involved in the satellite realm stems back about 10 years ago. Most of you probably recall that in 2011, there was a massive earthquake and tsunami off the coast of Japan. It generated large debris rafts, and there was also a nuclear reactor situation as well. So fast forward about 6 to 12 months after the tsunami, there was an alarm at high levels in the US government about whether or not there were large rafts of radioactive debris that would be imminently impacting Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest and the Aleutian Islands. So a request came down to NOAA for our unit to investigate if there was indeed large patches of debris. So at the time, shortly after the tsunami, we had requested some high resolution commercial data. That's actually external to NOAA, but we have access through to US government data buys and partnerships. So each one of these white patchy areas that you can see in the image is a debris raft. So they were quite large at the time. So we could see them with our eyes. They were very easy to delineate and categorize, but we also conducted a spectral assessment. So we were looking at how do these debris rafts emit across the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum? Because over time, these debris rafts will change in composition. The heavier components will sink. They will become dismantled. They will break down due to photodegradation. They'll become biofouled. And our main goal was to try to determine if we could detect these types of debris rafts out in the open ocean. So we knew it would be challenging. So we were tackling this from both a visual and a spectral perspective. So what we were able to achieve shortly after the tsunami is we found some different spectral compositions that captured the debris quite well. And we could use a target detection algorithm to do a rapid assessment of where the debris existed within the scene. So this was a very encouraging result for us. We thought, oh, you know, we're on the right track to being able to map plastics out in the open ocean. But unfortunately, for the reasons that I just mentioned, the compositions changed, the spectral properties evolved over time, and we were not able to apply this type of technique out in the open ocean. The plastics broke down and they became too small, and they fell below the detection threshold. So I want to fast forward to today and where we are with our current efforts in detection, and it revolves around macroplastics. So Caleb talked about inland debris in the dump sites in Indonesia, and Lauren with debris in inland waterways that eventually makes its way out into the open ocean. So the rest of the few minutes that I have, I'm going to focus on an open ocean setting, which is extremely challenging. And so the macroplastics that I'll be focusing on is derelict nets. This is the photo credit here goes to Ocean Voyages Institute. They're a nonprofit organization, and they sail to clean up these large several ton nets that are either lost or abandoned, but pose a serious threat and hazards to ecosystems, particularly in atolls. So these nets are massive, sometimes in excess of 10 tons, and there are thousands of them out in the open ocean. So NOAA, from the government side, has recognized that this is a problem too, and particularly in atolls in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, because what happens at high tide is that these nets can float into atolls and over the back reef, and at low tide, they will snag on the corals and remain stagnant and damage the environment. So every 1 to 2 years, NOAA will conduct large-scale debris removal efforts out at these atolls. And it's quite manual. It takes weeks to sail from mainland Hawaii, and then they deploy a team of divers. And when they do identify these nets, they actually physically have to be cut off of the reef and usually hauled out of the water with a crane, as you saw on the previous slide. So here's a picture of the atoll from the air and what a net looks like visually when it's snagged on a reef. So that's the part that's highlighted in the red circle. And so we have partnered with them to be able to achieve some ground truth, some ground verification of what these nets might look like in satellites. This is one of our success stories from back in 2014. There was a large net that was snagged on a reef. We requested some high resolution commercial data over that area. So on the left is the multispectral true color image. It's approximately 1.5 meters per pixel, and it's this red dot. So if I could draw your attention to the zoom box on the bottom left, it's this red speck. So nothing to write home about if you're looking at it with your eyes. You could probably find hundreds of red specks across this image. And this is where spectral information becomes so important too. It becomes our fingerprint for plastics versus other false positives. But what we could see in the monochromatic pair, it's just black and white, no color information, but a higher resolution. You can see that the pixel that corresponds to the red dot, it actually is quite anomalous. We can actually see a shape to it. So the NOAA marine debris removal staff, they went out and they were able to actually stand on it. And you can see the same curvature in the situ photo, which is quite amazing. And these nets are somewhat like glaciers, where you've maybe 10% on the surface and 90% is below. This particular net weighed 11 tons, and it took a team of people to actually remove it from the water. More importantly than what we can see with our eyes, we wanted to know what the spectral curve looked like so we could build a library. And so what we noticed is that we get a very strong peak shortly after 800, close to 840 nanometers. And the reason why this result is so encouraging to us is because the paper that Lauren described in her presentation, where they were detecting coastal plastics in Sentinel 2, her and her research team also noted the same peak. So we have consistency between the coastal detection of marine debris and the derelict nets that are out in the open water. So this is how we're building our library. So Caleb talked about his sample size being small in Indonesia, and Lauren has a small sample size off the coast of Thailand. Our sample size is even smaller in terms of ground truth and ground validation for these nets because it's in a remote environment. So the highlights of this is that there are more cleanup expeditions that are planned. There's one scheduled for March and September, and we plan to leverage that for ground truth purposes. And this time we won't be alone in it. We will have this fabulous team of panelists. We all work together in technical meetings. We're part of the giant remote sensing technical group. It's chaired by NOAA, and it was stood up about 1 year ago. It includes active research and detection of inland debris, the TPA sites, plastics in rivers, and open ocean debris, as well as machine learning. And in 1 year, we've tripled the amount of contributing agencies and units and companies to this group. So what's really cool and hasn't been mentioned so far is as we continue to achieve success in the detection of these derelict nets, and there are NGOs or government agencies or private sector companies that can remove them from the water, they will be upcycled. So there's companies like Bifusion and Adidas who plan to take these nets and upcycle them, turn them into athletic gear, turn them into turf, and make sure that it's reused and it doesn't become garbage that ends up in a dump site. So I wanted to take just 1 minute to talk about some recommendations and tie in the presentations that you've seen, and then I'll send it back to the moderator to open the floor for some dialogue and discussion. But recommendation number 1 that I have is about closing the data gap, closing the gap in access to satellite data. And that could be achieved in one of 2 ways. And that is leveraging partnerships to access licensed imagery through data buys and partnerships. So the US government can tap into some federal resources to purchase imagery or obtain it at free source. And the reason why that this is so important is because a lot of the satellites that are freely available, especially the ones in NOAA, they're used for large-scale weather watch products like monitoring tropical cyclones or volcanic ash or heavy precipitation events. And these are all hazards that we can monitor with satellite data, but they're not well suited for the detection of marine debris. So if I could draw your attention to this red box on the top, and if I had to ask you, what do you think that feature is inside? Would you think it's a cloud? Would you think it's an artifact? Would you think it's a wave cap? Would you think it's a structure? The spatial resolution of this image is 250 meters. And so it's relatively coarse. Aren't going to be able to detect plastics with this type of data at this point in time. But the advantage is, in this one scene, I can view the entire Gulf of Mexico. So I have a coarse spatial resolution, but a very large footprint. So here is a look at how Sentinel-2 sees that same spec. So now it's starting to come in focus. This is a 10-meter pixel as opposed to the 250 meter on the left. So I can tell that I have a structure, and interestingly, I have an anomaly associated with it. I can also see clouds, and I can also see the direction of the wind flow based on just the striations in the background water. But for Sentinel-2, here is the swath width on the bottom. It's only several hundred kilometers. So instead of seeing the entire Gulf of Mexico, it becomes increasingly narrow. So when we move into the type of data that you need for debris detection, I'm showing you how the Worldview satellite, which is closer to 1 meter, as opposed to 10 or 250 meter, sees a small boat. And this swath width becomes very, very narrow, closer to 10 kilometers. So if you think about trying to use satellite data and scale it to be able to characterize debris in an open ocean, it's a very difficult issue when it comes to data access, because the swath widths are so narrow that offer the spatial resolutions that are required for debris. Second recommendation is continued outreach. Similar to Lauren, I didn't think that I would, 1 year ago, I wouldn't have guessed I'd be sitting here today at a marine debris forum. So it's amazing what can be done if we collaborate with public, with industry, with academia, with private sector, the US government, and these will provide us more opportunities for ground validation to be able to continue to grow our confirmed cases in debris, whether it's inland or in rivers or in open waters. So for microplastics, we're not quite at that scale yet, but that's the intent, to move into that direction, to use satellite data to be able to detect and characterize microplastics. So, and that long-term plan would be to use science-based information to drive policy change. And so for macroplastics, this was mentioned by previous presenter, is get industry involved and get them accountable. So one suggestion that I would have is to adopt a standard practice of geotagging these fishing nets. So when they are lost, there is a responsible party that's held accountable for creating the marine litter. Or on the other hand, maybe it offers an opportunity for them to retrieve their net. And then it could also serve the purpose of being a confirmed case of a derelict net that we would be able to use to promote our own ground verification efforts. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jennifer. Thank you very much.
I love panels like this because you guys basically, I mean, Ellen, you wrapped it up. Actually, my first question was, and it came from some people in the audience as well, you know, for all of you, like, you know, what are next steps? And you laid out some really, your recommendations were some very specific kind of next steps that need to happen. Let me, we got a whole bunch of questions and now I got, because, so Crystal Asaton from the Secure World Foundation had said, she said, there's been a great overview of the technology. What's next steps? What should be done next with the data? And just kind of add to that, Scott Hajost, who's from the Global Wildlife Whistleblower Program, said, you know, it's also maybe a potential next step kind of question. Does the platform and Mindro Foundation track plastic, I assume, anticipate tracking plastic debris entering the Southern Ocean around Antarctica? And, you know, could this work also detect plastic pollution from ships covered by the MARPOL Annex 5 and under the US Act to prevent pollution from ships? So let me toss that out there first about thinking about in terms of next steps. We had a couple of very specific questions. Maybe start with Fabian.
Sure. Well, I mean, in terms of kind of next steps, so we have a methodology, and now the next step is to turn those algorithms into a way that it can inform decisions. So we need to operationalize all this research and development that we've done. But of course, we want to make sure that whatever we produce is going to be useful to those that we intend to serve. We talked about enforcement, we talked about policy decision maker. And so what we want to do is to engage those intended end users to understand exactly what it is that they would need in terms of the type of capabilities that such a platform would need to provide in order for it to be useful. So we don't want to just build something and then hope that people will use it. We are going to spend a lot of time understanding exactly what the needs are on the ground so we can be as directly useful as we possibly can be. With regard to the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, part of the challenge is that the publicly available satellite imagery that we've been discussing, whether it's from NOAA or NASA or the European Space Agency, does not cover the entire world, right? So there are areas where we will not have satellite imagery and therefore we won't be able to detect plastic. Now, if we have images, then we can detect it.
Someone else want to jump in on some also possible next steps? I mean, maybe Lauren, I mean, you're, Grayson, let's do it. Okay, Grayson and then Lauren.
Perfect. So I think that there's, I agree with what Fabian is saying here, and to build on top of that as well. I think that there's kind of three main things that we could do to push the ball forward as far as creating data and better understanding this issue. And so to put those out, the first would be harmonized collection methods and reporting metrics. The second would be coordinating investment approaches to support infrastructure development in key markets and innovations. That includes stuff like developing platforms like the wonderful platform that the Minderoo Foundation is building. The third one is, and the last one here is, make this a big tent inclusive effort through leveraging the role of participatory education or participant education. In other words, promote citizen science, crowdsourcing to collect data and ground truth or verify imagery, and embrace the tenets of open data as a means to enact or elicit civic hacking to visualize, viralize, and utilize the findings that we find through this analysis. So those are three main thoughts that I have as far as how we could go forward generally to try to promote and utilize this information.
Let me insert, there was a question that came that it's actually go for Caleb and Lauren that relates to that last point that you made. Oh Lord, move my thing here. The satellite data you highlighted was all multispectral. Wait, sorry. I've got so many questions. Well, there's a question about also getting kind of boots on the ground, like to actually verify this. And just have to insert today, when I took a quick walk with my dog, I intentionally went to the stormwater stream. I picked up big hunks of styrofoam this morning. So I stole some data from your satellites, people. You're not going to see it. But so boots on the ground. Can you tell me a little bit about confirming your spectrals, folks? I told that wrong.
Do you want me to jump in? I can quickly talk about what we have. So I have 9 perfect pixels in the world, thanks entirely to the University of the Aegean, who've put out 10 by 10 meter targets of different types of plastic, and we've learned so much from that. And that is the reason that we have a perfect spectral shape of plastic. In terms of validating what we have seen, that's a lot trickier, because often I'll see something that passed beyond a coastline a week ago or 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. So that's a bit trickier. But our work in rivers, that's what we're doing next, is we're starting to look in rivers as well. That is going to have boots on the ground. We're going to have people literally standing and counting plastics as they go past, seeing as we're seeing it like at the same time as satellite overpasses. Thanks to Noah and Davida and Ellen, we're going to have high resolution Worldview data, Sentinel data, radar data, and people on the ground. So it's a big validation campaign because we recognize how lacking that is. We would love more in situ validation data.
So Caleb, are you the nice guy who tries to get people to walk through landfills for you?
We've had discussions to that end, and we'll probably have some people on the ground soon in Indonesia. So it is a little bit easier on land, given that it's hopefully more concentrated and more stable, to be able to actually have some people go out and verify, as well as just people most often are there versus areas of the ocean. So it's something that we're excited about working on in the next steps, because there are a lot of the model outputs that I look at and I'm not sure, is the model underperforming, or are we detecting some more transient plastic source? I will give one other plug for just creative ground truthing. And it just really is striking just how much data about the world is actually accessible. Is Indonesia, where we've been working, has tremendous Google Street View map coverage. So for a lot of these detected landfill sites, I can just go in on Google Maps, drop the little man, and see what it looked like in 2017 or something like that, to give some scalable ground truth there. So some inventive methods as well.
Well, actually, that reminds me, I meant to ask this earlier, that so you're working in Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia's got this, the government has this massive goal of decreasing ocean plastic leakage by 70%. Can you say anything briefly about your kind of partnerships with them? And just for the record, I'm bringing y'all back soon because we have to go much deeper into this conversation. But tell me a little bit more about who or what you're doing in Indonesia with the partners. Fabian.
I can take it. Yeah. So the Minderoo Foundation has entered a memorandum of understanding with the government of Indonesia with the goal of helping reduce plastic debris in the ocean and help build recycling infrastructure and capabilities in the country. But to your point, I think it'd be great to bring all the folks, including groups in Southeast Asia, as well as people within the Minderoo Foundation that are very specifically working on the partnership and implementing it. I think they will be providing a lot of really great insights as to what we will be doing and what we've done so far.
Does someone else, Ellen, did you want to add in? I mean, one of the questions that I'd also been thinking of too, I mean, not just for the US government, but just, like what you gave a few examples of like what the government could do. Do you have some other thoughts, and anyone else in the group, about, how can governments maybe incentivize this kind of research more? I don't know, Ellen, is
that's an excellent question. We really are in the infancy stages of this type of collaboration with Minderoo and with Plymouth Marine Laboratory and with Earthrise and Caleb's team. This is why how we made such a valuable connection here is with Grayson Shore, because at NOAA we sit, or most of us for that matter, sit behind seas of computer screens and we're doing analysis and data, but how do we get it out there to the point that it's usable? How do we connect it to policy and really drive change? So I would kick this question over to Grayson for perhaps a recommendation on how we get the science out there to industry and to the companies that really could enact change.
The ball's been kicked to you, Grayson.
All right, and I receive. So, thank you, Ellen. And just to point out too, I mean, we have one example to this is leveraging the scientific resources that we have, not only here in the US government, which are immense, for example, Ellen's team at NOAA NESDIS, but also external folks as well that we have through partnerships, with everyone here on the panel, for example, others, and even bilateral relationships, multilateral organizations that I mentioned also in my slideshow. And so I think that there's literally dozens of conversations that I have each week with folks on this panel and outside of this panel that are trying to attack this issue, and actually trying to attack it in similar ways. There's folks, yes, creating applications in the field, PADI divers that are logging in systems and tracking information. And then, the government of Japan is a good example of trying to increase data. The UN's countermeasures program is another. So I think it's a lot of merging these programs together, which I think is important. And that's why I kind of mentioned earlier the harmonizing of collection and reporting metrics. If we can build some type of database that we can pull from, if we can have more points to ground truth from, that's important too, to increase the accuracy of these algorithms that we're building. And also in the last point too, I mentioned infrastructure earlier. I mean, beyond kind of the obvious of building waste management infrastructure to try to prevent this issue, or designing for recycling and things of that nature, there's also the importance of utilizing, for example, if there's trash aggregation devices, probably folks have seen the ones by Ocean Conservancy out in Vietnam, or the Ocean Cleanup, also launching similar items that are just in river and they collect trash. There's even one in the Baltimore Harbor.
Anacostia River, we have it there too.
Yep, what was it?
Anacostia River has some too.
Anacostia River, another great example. So leveraging these existing infrastructure and even just putting a camera on those things that can identify, and this technology is already out there to identify with AI, what plastic is passing by or what plastic is being collected, that further adds into this model, this information that we can pull from to make, have a better idea of the problem and then better design more effective policy solutions to address it.
Okay. Speaking of more information, I have Dr. Michelle Garak from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Don't know if they're in your village yet, but maybe they should be, because she asks Lauren and Fabian about the satellite data you highlighted was all multispectral. Could you mention imaging spectroscopy? For example, hyperspectral from space. How can that improve your identification and monitoring efforts? So she asked also before about boots on the ground, as she's talking higher up. Lauren, Fabian, you want to?
I mean, Lauren, if you want to chime in, or I can go. So no, that's a wonderful question. Actually, we are working with a partner, Azavia, that is currently testing Avery's capability, which is a GPL plane, essentially with an hyperspectral instrument. So what does that mean? Hyperspectral is like, as opposed to having those 12 bands that Caleb talked about, now we're talking about like over 100 different bands. And the more bands, the more detail you can see. So we're actually testing whether or not we can use hyperspectral from this airborne device, but we are also working with a Italian satellite that also has an hyperspectral instrument on it to try to see whether we can improve our algorithm using that.
Yeah. Lauren, one final quick comment, and then I'm going to wrap us up here today. Lauren, did you have anything else to add?
No, I just wanted to name the satellite. It's the hyperspectral data from Prisma that we are testing at the moment.
Nice. Well, so first of all, I already said I'm inviting you all back. I'm actually in conversations with the countermeasures folks at the Japanese, so we can have a bigger village party next time. In the year of the ox, Happy New Year, by the way, in 2 years, Chinese New Year. This was a great, I had too much fun today. I mean, seeing the potential of how this kind of technology helping with the monitoring, I mean, to understand the scale of the problem, but also there's so many actions being taken, as Grayson said, but how do we know where we're actually succeeding? We did have a number of questions more on what to do about microplastics. We'll have to deal with that next time. I'd like to thank the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership that supports my work. So they're part of the village too. And again, you all are doing incredibly fascinating and important work, and thanking the audience to, you could keep sending in questions. We could ping them off to the speakers. And thank you very much. And tune in. We've got more plastic meetings coming up next month. Thank you. Have a good morning.